Today on Cribwolf Talks, we are thrilled to present Tim Welch, president of TWC Inc. Tim recently delivered an insightful presentation titled Key Factors for a Successful Affordable Housing Project at the Intentional Community Consortium Housing Forum, hosted by KW Habilitation and Caris Disability Services at KW's office in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, on October 8, 2024. His deep expertise in the affordable housing sector makes him the perfect guest to explore the strategies that can drive success in this crucial area of community development. Take a listen.
Very simply, in terms of the key factors: land, money, and lots of determination. So let's start out with a show of hands. Who has land that they either own or can develop new housing on? Let's see a show of hands. Lots of land. Excellent. And who has lots of determination from their staff and board to do that? Great. Okay. And who has millions of dollars in the bank they don't know what to do with? See a show of hands. Okay. Everyone go to that table. The money part can be tricky, definitely. But there's lots and lots and lots of more details, but these are what it boils down to, key factors in terms of creating new affordable housing. I'll come back to the project you saw up there, which was a 60-unit development in the city of Hamilton by Hamilton East Kiwanis that was done in collaboration with a support organization. So when some of you have already, how many of your organizations have developed new housing in the last decade or so? Let's see a show of hands there. Okay, excellent. That's great. So that many of you are familiar is starting out with the goals of, as an organization, what do you want to achieve in the new housing? So that you're looking at the question of who are you trying to house, and a mix, because certainly with intentional communities, inclusive communities, to have a range of housing for different people with different needs. The building next door is an excellent example that has some residents have support through KW Rehabilitation. Others are just modest income people who need an affordable place to live. So it's a really nice intentional mix in the community. The ranges of affordability is a question that when developing new housing, you have to think about carefully. While probably most of the residents that you're looking to support receive the ODSP shelter allowance, which I think is now at $582 a month. Hard to find rent in the market these days at $582 a month, of course. But to make a project work financially, a lot of different nonprofits are looking at a much wider range of rents. And because, in some ways, because the rents have gone so crazy in the last number of years, that we're working with nonprofits that are saying, okay, if we have a $1,500 a month one-bedroom apartment, certainly even in the mid-sized cities in Ontario, that's still actually better than the rental market out there when people are looking for apartments to rent. So if we have a range where some of the units are bringing in that level of rent, that's going to help offset, not totally offset, but help offset some of the costs of developing and operating housing. So for yourselves looking at new development, give careful consideration to what kind of range of affordability. One of the things that we spend a lot of time on is going through financial feasibility pro formas of capital costs and operating costs. And we go through many dozens of versions. We bounce them off CMHC staff. They'll talk about the fun they have with spreadsheets as well, to figure out what's the right combination of capital funding and revenue that will make a project work. And it does take a lot of back and forth, given that costs of building, very hard to get things below $400,000 a unit for affordable housing these days. In many cases, $500,000 is not uncommon when you look at the all-in cost of developing new apartments. The scale and the type of housing. Are you looking, depending on your organization, size of your land, what kind of financial resources either you can bring or can access through a variety of government or other community programs? What's the scale of the development? So you may have had a large site that perhaps could fit 40 units, but your financial reality is, as you go through the process, let's look at a dozen units is what can fit on that site. Maybe you can try to design something to phase a project in to make things more financially viable. So to take a look at at the scale, if you're looking at likely accessibility is going to be an important issue when you're looking at the design. And then also with the, for some providers in smaller towns, they may be able to do one-level row housing. We've been involved with a few developer nonprofit groups over that in that type of housing in Owen Sound, for example, that is really cost efficient to build and can still be accessible. It's not perhaps the most dense use of land, but can still work financially. Obviously, if you're in a smaller city or a larger urban area, you're going to look at more density and what's the physical type of housing, an apartment building with an elevator, etc. So to have a lot of discussions early on about those goals. You have to be an optimist moving forward in this work, and I'm sure most of you are. Even you're a realistic optimist because you know the reality was presented in terms of the needs, but to take some time at the beginning when you're looking to develop of what can be achievable. Because if you have a vision that's too far ahead of what can be produced reality, you're not going to produce housing and you're not going to house people at all. And that's not where you want to be. You want to make sure something realistic is achieved. When you set the goals, so you still want to have absolutely the goal and strive towards that, back to the determined organization, but recognize housing development is a multi-year process and things evolve. So whether it's the type of units, the physical structure, whether you end up with 24 units instead of 30 units because you've gone through the planning process, that resolves. So you've got to maintain some flexibility, but still try to achieve the goals of what you're working towards. So recognize when you're creating the initial plan and initial business plan, that is definitely going to be evolving. But it is important to have that work plan, the objectives of what you're trying to achieve set out and keep working towards that as you move forward. It's also really important, of course, as many of you will know, is to build a team. In developing housing, there's a large number of professionals needed, everything from architect to planning process, going through the municipal planning approvals process can be a fairly complex process if any of those have been through that. You also will need, obviously, a builder to physically build the housing. And depending on your organization's strength, you'll need a residential property manager who is going to operate, particularly if you're getting to a larger scale apartment building that you might not have the in-house resources to think about that. And then to think about project management. And this is sort of, I suppose, self-interest, I'll raise my hands. But whether you get outside consultants to work on project management or you have staff identified to do that, it's not something you can do off the side of your desk. I mean, Anne can. I think I've seen Anne do that almost an incredible amount off the side of her desk. But it is a major undertaking, whether it's a dozen or 20 or a 50 unit or 100 unit development. It's a lot of work. It's a multi-year process. So to think about who's going to be managing and keeping the project moving forward. Collaborations is also something we talk about. And there's a phrase someone told me many years ago that partnerships are the best way to do things unless you can do it yourself. Partnerships add complexity. They can be great, but you've got to think about that kind of collaboration and carefully think about the roles so that you don't have duplication and overlap. You want to have in a collaboration, each side of the partnership or collaboration is clear about what the goals they have and what they are trying to achieve in that collaboration. I mentioned about the building from Hamilton East Kiwanis. So they collaborated with the local support service agency in Hamilton for, I think it was 13 of the 60 units that they would rent out to clients they support. So it was very clear that that support organization would give input into the design of the units for the residents they were going to support, but the development was certainly driven by and the building owned by Hamilton East Kiwanis. But the housing we provided at affordable rents needed for the residents moving in, and they would have long-term right to occupy those units. So it was a collaboration with defined roles for each of those two organizations. So again, just to reemphasize, there needs to be lots of discussion at the start if there's going to be a collaboration with another organization. Money. So this is the metaphor we use a fair bit, perhaps overuse it some days, of lasagna funding, that there is no one full source that's going to make a project financially viable. It's going to be many different layers, some larger and meatier, to stretch out the metaphor a little bit. Sorry, we're still 2 hours from lunch almost, and anyways. and others will be small pieces that will still be really important. So there can be everything from CMHC, we'll talk about their seed funding, as well as some of the other larger programs that provide some below market interest rate costs. I'm not going to go into the details, because that's the next presentation. But it is often 4, 5, 6 layers of funding and financing, including equity from the organizations, in order to make a project work. And often it will be over a year or two before you've got, and sometimes a little longer than that, before you have all those layers come together to make a project work financially. If anyone expects there to be one large grant that's going to pay for a building and have no mortgage, I don't, yes? Sorry, that's the right reaction. That's a pleasant chuckle. We wish there were programs, but that hasn't been the reality for many, many decades in Ontario and Canada. That doesn't mean we shouldn't collectively as organizations advocate for even more improved programs, but it is a reality of building things together. We've got a number of programs highlighted. Say there's a number of things from CMHC that they'll talk about. There's lots of acronyms, of course, in the housing development world. OFI-COCHI, Provincial Municipal Fund. Some comes from the federal government to the province to the service managers. If everyone knows the term municipal service managers, your county or region or city that delivers the housing programs. What we've seen a lot more in the last couple of years is municipalities who are not service managers, who are in a two-tier system like Waterloo Region, cities of Cambridge, Kitchener, Waterloo, and the 4 townships, become more active in the support of affordable housing, whether it's more flexible planning rules, whether it's bringing in what's called a community improvement plan, which could mean not paying property taxes or planning fees for housing projects. And in some municipalities, such as Kitchener, the one we're in, has a great program where funding that was flowed from the federal government's Housing Accelerator Fund is being used to provide grants of up to $10,000 per unit towards all the soft costs to fully design a building, to do engineering studies, to do planning reports, to do traffic studies, shadowing impacts, et cetera, that are all required for planning. So that's certainly not the case in all municipalities, but it's a really positive initiative, because for most of the major government funding programs, money's not released until the start of construction, or in some cases a few months after the start of construction. So it can be very costly to move a project to the point of the start of construction, even if you have land that you're able to bring at no cost to the table. We're also seeing a number of municipalities more often issuing proposal calls or expressions of interest to offer up municipally owned land essentially at no cost, which again is a great help. And for those of you looking for development opportunities, make sure you're in touch with the municipalities. And a lot of the local municipalities, sometimes it's just the start of a conversation that many municipalities are reviewing sites that they might have owned for as a parking lot or whatever for a couple of decades and think, is this really needed, this parking lot on the edge of town that's not getting much business, or is the combination could have some housing and still keep some units for parking? So there's a lot more creativity we're finding in many municipalities across Ontario on that front. There also will be, in many cases, there's I'll say the best, not to compliment CMHC staff too much, but the best financing rate is through the CMHC programs in terms of the lowest interest rate and a 50-year amortization. But there also may be situations where you work with your local financial institution, credit union, bank, or other financial institution that you'll have to consider for private financing. And also to think about, again, when looking at your equity, do you have land operations that can potentially be refinanced to pull out some equity? That's been more common for nonprofits that have been operating for 35 years or more and paid off their mortgages. So it's not that common or not that easy, but that can be a source to look at. And I recognize some of your land will have arrangements with the provincial government that you need to work through in terms of what interest they might have registered on title for land that you own. One of the things too also that makes things fairly complex is all those sort of 4 or 5 or 6 levels of financing and funding will have slightly different rules around definitions of affordability, requirements for length of how long things have to be affordable, and it can be a challenge just trying to get things to line up. I mean, your goal probably is to try to make things as affordable as possible, but still making sure that housing is financially viable, because housing programs these days, generally, you've got to structure it to get capital funding to make a project work so that the rents that are collected cover your operating costs, whether it's mortgage, staff, property management fees, utilities, etc. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I don't know if anyone's keeping track of how many different definitions of affordable there are out there, but there are a lot. So something to keep in mind and work through. And what can also be challenging is, I started to talk a little bit, is the timing of both lining up funding. So I mentioned the OFI-COCHI funding, or some funding that comes through municipalities. That timing could happen one year and not the next year, but you've got other funding that's going to come the second year. So sometimes it's really hard to line it all up together. Or there's going to be a proposal call for municipal land, but there's not a proposal call for capital funding. So it can be really challenging to try to make that all come together. As I mentioned, that we're seeing an increasing amount of municipal activity happen in terms of support, because the housing crisis is so widespread. It's not just for poor people anymore. As the cliche goes, that because it's that I was at a community meeting in Huntsville last night, and so much of it, the pressure there is workforce housing, that they can't, we heard from some employers, they can't get people to come to town to work, whether it's in the construction industry, the service industry, personal support workers, because there isn't rental housing for them to move into in the community. So it's housing not just as social justice, but it's housing as an important part of economic development. So that's a really positive message of trying to get response from community organizations as well as all the different levels of government. To be realistic, as I mentioned, that most of the major funding programs don't release funds until the start of construction. But even for a 20-unit project, it's quite easy for costs to be a couple $100,000 before you'll get to that stage. There is, not to get too much into detail, that for a major CMHC program, you have to have a building close to being fully designed and a cost estimate undertaken for that design before there'll be any final approval from CMHC. So when moving forward, to think carefully about what are some of the sources, either from your organization, some of the government programs, or other community organizations that can help cover these initial upfront soft costs. I haven't taken a look at my time there. 10:30. Okay, still good. I didn't talk too much about planning approvals, just to say a little more that there's some changes that the provincial government brought in under the Planning Act that provide more flexibility for planning approvals, but that's something that's also, as you're doing housing development, you need to keep an eye on in terms of what the planning approvals process is going to be. It's faster, but your funders want to say, get moving to build the housing as quick as you can. You want to say, you want to build the housing as quick as you can, but sometimes there can be a large number of steps to go through on the planning approvals process. So when you're starting out and when thinking about the goals and the scale of the development, think about how complex the planning approvals process is going to be. So for example, if the land that you're thinking of develop is zoned for townhouses, but to get to build a 4-story apartment building on it, you would need what's called an official plan amendment. That is going to take a large number of months and a lot more cost to do the planning approvals. So is the bird in the hand, or a half loafer is a phrase we used to use a long time ago. If you can get 20 units approval in 6 months, but 30 or 40 units are going to take 2 years of planning approvals process, start to weigh the options of what can move forward. So this is not we all want to build as much housing as possible, absolutely, but sometimes it's looking at what are some of the trade-offs that can make a project be successful, move forward, and actually create the housing for people to move into. So as I mentioned about the municipal process, and it's not just municipal councillors, it is absolutely important, and probably most of you already know this. If you're planning to move forward with a new housing development, absolutely have a talk with the mayor, have a talk with your local councillor, and get them on board as soon as you can, because there certainly could be some roadblocks or bumps ahead, whether it's from some neighbors who don't want to see a dramatic 3-story building built next to them that will totally change the community. So it's really important to start to build that relationship, as well as talking to municipal councillors and staff about some of the potential financial help, whether it's direct or sometimes indirect, to move through the planning approvals process. It is, however, important and a good practice to reach out to the immediate physical neighbors of where you're looking to have the housing development, to let them know what you're looking to do. And I think for all of your organizations, you're already in the community doing great things. Hopefully neighbors will recognize that. It still gets some people nervous about any change in their neighborhood. So it is really important in advance of the official municipal planning approvals process to do that good outreach, whether it's a flyering, a simple knock on the door. And again, there may be some neighbors, if you're looking to intensify a site you already know, you probably know a number of the neighbors already in the adjacent area. Also, of course, for the operational costs, when you're working through your plan for the development, there's all of the capital costs, construction, soft costs, land costs, etc., but to work through a realistic operating budget. So some of you that may operate apartment buildings, you've got a good basis to build on of what those operating costs are. For others, that's something you may have to work on, including if you're looking to go into a mixed building where some is support service, some are people just looking for affordable housing. Sort of think through what the typical costs are for property management fees for regular apartment buildings, but also for staffing, of course. If you are you having people you're already supporting that don't have adequate or appropriate housing moving into the apartments, or the additional people you're going to provide support for, of course, what's going to be the operational cost for new staff for those supports. As I talked about with committed board members, it is a long process. We've been through two projects that were both 7 years, one to create 8 units, one to create 6 units, which is much too long for that few number of units. But generally speaking, projects will be 3 years if you're really lucky, but probably 4 or 5. And I don't know if the CMHU have a different perspective. But from the time you start and set up the goal, it is going to be a multi-year process. So recognize that. And hopefully you have good support from your board members to continue that work. Many boards set up development subcommittees. You'll get some very keen members that will want to be active, which is great. I had a group a dozen years ago in London that had 3 retired engineers and 1 lawyer and 1 social worker as the development committee, and it was very active. The retired engineers were unbelievable in their focus on detail, but they were great. They dedicated an amazing amount of time to make the project happen, and this 30-unit development was built.
That concludes today's discussion with Tim Welch, President of TWC Inc., on the key factors for successful, affordable housing projects. His insights on sustainable development, community engagement, and strategic partnerships are invaluable as we work toward more inclusive, resilient housing solutions. Thank you, Tim, for sharing your expertise, and thank you all for tuning in to Cribwolf Talks. Stay tuned for more informative sessions on building more affordable housing. If you have missed any of our shows, find us on YouTube and like and subscribe Cribwolf Talks. Let's help those who need our help.